Now, when we talk about the techniques in the novel Maestro, quite often we just try and think of language techniques, but there are a lot of other things that we can talk about. So the big focus I think that we can have is on this word construction. We can say, well, how does Peter Goldsworthy construct his novel? So we can look at bigger things rather than just going into the minute details of language. Looking for similes and metaphors and personification and description. They're all very valid, and you can use those by all means, and they're just as valid as what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to introduce you to some other ideas that you might consider using. You might find them a little bit more comfortable to use. You'd be a bit more fluent in the way that you um, are able to use them in your speech. While we're on this page too, you'll notice that Maestro is underlined, and while you're delivering your speech, it's not that important. It's just a good habit to get into that when you're talking about a text, so a novel, a film, a play, etc., a picture book, when it's the complete text, you underline it. When it's generally a poem or a song, you put it in inverted commas. So the first thing we want to talk about is this idea that when we're developing our argument, we want to talk about ideas first. Ideas have to be at the front of whatever you're saying. So start with the big idea, talk about it, explore it, then support it with examples from the novel, quotes, and then what you'll do is move into that technique sort of area. So how the novel is constructed. So you're going to use that to say, here's the idea in the novel. This is a quote that supports that idea and illustrates it. And then a really good thing to do is be able to talk about what Peter Goldsworthy is attempting to do. So it might be Peter Goldsworthy constructs this idea through the use of da 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 da, or it might be that you're saying Goldsworthy challenges his audience through. But if you don't have to use Goldsworthy all the time, but those verbs like constructs and challenges and shapes, all those sort of words are good verbs that are going to lead you to saying something analytical. Okay. Oh, I didn't notice that when I made this little graph. But the big three things when we're talking about any story, I suppose, is the setting, the characterization, and the theme, the themes that are present in the story. And so they're a starting point from which we can look and say, well, the settings shape or they reflect the character. Characterization is obviously to do with, we're watching the transformation of an individual through the things that they encounter, the people that they meet, the challenges that they face, all those things, all those incidents that occur that lead them to coming to a new perspective about themselves, about others, or the world around them. So that's that insight. So from going on a journey, individuals come to new points of realization, and then the themes that are developed in the novel could drive your argument as well. So that's one thing that we could start with. You don't have to talk about those three things. You might not have the time and it might not suit what you're saying. So really you can pick and choose, okay, from these things and others. So when we look at characterization, we're really talking about that tracing the development of say Paul's maturation. He moves from at the start of the novel he's a child, and by the end of the novel he's an adult. Okay, so we're exposed to his thoughts, his attitudes, how he deals with things, how he responds to particular situations, and then what he thinks and reflects on, and the observations he makes and the conclusions that he draws. So A good story will do that, won't it? You'll get inside the head of the character and you'll understand their thought processes, and you come to really see from their point of view what it is that has impacted on them and how they've grown as an individual from that. We talked in a previous lesson about the structure. So you can talk about how Goldsworthy has divided the novel into 7 parts, and the purpose of that is to trace the process of maturation. So Paul moving from innocence to understanding. So that's another thing that is a simple thing that you can build into your argument, or you might just focus on one aspect or one chapter of the novel, and so, well, this is the pivotal point, and it's divided and it's set here for a particular reason. Okay, now the other thing we were talking about was theme. Okay, and so there are lots of themes in there that you can choose, and I've just put 2 there. So it might be this theme of guilt when we're looking at Keller, and why he ends up in Darwin, and how the relationship he has with Paul is really awkward at the beginning of their meetings because of the guilt that Keller carries. He has this baggage that he brings with him, and when we get to know him better, we come to understand that he's really fragile, and ultimately he doesn't want to harm anyone. He doesn't want to hurt anyone. So he puts up this barrier between them. But we see that unravel through the relationship that's developed between Paul and Keller. So and that's an interesting thing to look at, I think, too. That both benefit from it. Paul obviously learns a few life lessons from the Maestro, so he learns it musically, but he learns about life as well. But Keller also gains a lot. He learns to trust again, and he learns about love, and about the strength of relationships in life. And so there's lots of things you can look at there if you wanted to. If you're talking about something, then you can say this is apparent through the theme of guilt. The other one, obviously, up there is maturation. So we're tracing that development of Paul, and I suppose maturation, where when we're looking at Paul, is he's moving from a world of innocence to understanding and all the things he learns, and I think that we see through Keller that you don't get to a point in your life where you finally understand everything. Even at Keller's age, he's still learning about life, and you can really reflect on and think about what it is that allows us to continue to learn, and what are the things that we do continue to learn. And a lot of it comes down to that interaction between people, and the dealings that they have and the relationships that they forge, and they lead to new insights. Okay, if we look at language and style as another 2 types of techniques that are evident in the novel, we could look at the way the story is told in first person perspective. And so it's told by the older Paul reminiscing on his experiences as he grows up. And so we gain insight into his thoughts and feelings, and his perspectives and attitudes as they're occurring. And he is a pretty reliable character. When you do look back on things, you have a tendency of either glorifying or romanticizing things that occur. But I think we're getting a pretty frank reflection, or representation of his challenges as he grows up. So we can look at that and we can talk about that and say that here is the thing that Peter Goldsworthy he's made that choice to write it in the first person to give us that intimate insight into the workings of Paul's mind. We can obviously look for similes and examples of personification and irony and all sorts of things that relate to, figurative language. So you might have a quote that encompasses that, so we can pop that in as well. That's another way we can do it, and that's probably the way most of us are thinking of covering techniques in the delivery of our speech. But there's so much more to the things that we can talk about. And sometimes it's appropriate to use a quote, but you'll find that if you're talking about things like structure and, like we were saying with the 7 parts of the novel, it's not appropriate to use a quote. So don't feel like you have to force a quote into what you're saying just to meet that TEE sort of model. It's not necessary. Okay, we've talked about setting, and that Darwin, Adelaide, Vienna reflect important stages in Paul's development. We can look at it for Keller as well, and that Darwin is his own personal purgatory, and he sends himself there to suffer for the life that he had lived and for the sins that he believes he's committed. So it is interesting to look at how the places that Paul visits reflect the particular periods in his life. So that's something we can talk about. We can talk about motifs. So music is used to reflect Keller's state of mind. So, we know when he was younger and he was very flamboyant, he played music like Wagner, and he had this air of arrogance about him, and that really betrayed him. And he said something like, it's not the right quote. If you want to, I can't remember, but set your lies to music. So he's pretty much saying that music can deceive you, and that point in his life, he was caught in that moment, and he believed, because he played for Hitler, that he was above the Nazi regime and ideology, and he suffered, and he was punished for that. So he now chooses to play more somber type music and more technical music, and that's his form of self-punishment. Okay, and he says any time that he begins to feel that he wants to play that light, flippant, romantic style music, that he has that urge to cut a digit off his finger. Okay, so music really does convey the two lives that Keller's lived, the life in the past and the current life. And so they're sort of interesting contrasts, those two worlds. So we've talked about physical setting, but music is used as another way of showing the two settings, or the two Kellers. And Hennish says perhaps his Keller had died. Oh no, Paul says of Hennish, perhaps his Keller had died long before mine was born, or something like that. And it's showing that music is a landscape that is representative of Keller at particular stages in his life. Paul's musical choices also reflect who he is at a particular stages in his life. And he's not too fussed about rock and roll music, but he finds it a really good way of gaining popularity. And that's superficiality. It's 3 chords, it's basic, but and he thinks it's way beneath him, but he uses it as a vehicle for him to find comfort, and it fulfills the need at a particular time in his life. So that's something interesting to explore too, the motif of music. Now, we were talking about contrast, and we have talked about this term binary opposites. So binaries, are really, you have two, bi for two, and so you have these forces in the novel that are competing for the outcome of the story, of the narrative. Okay, so there's life and death, and truth and deception, suffering and peace, and innocence and understanding, and there are a whole heap more. And it's just a matter of thinking about these things, and it depends what you're talking about. We can look at the music, the classical music and the rock and roll and what they represent, and they're the two different choices, I suppose. And then with Kelly, you've got the two types of classical music as well. Paul talks about his parents and their musical styles are they differ, and he says that he is like a crossbreed of his parents. He's influenced by both of them. He's their mulatto. So that's an interesting thing too. But so you can talk about the contrasting ideas that are competing for the outcome of the narrative. That's an interesting thing to talk about too. Okay, and finally, just to really consolidate that, it is not important to follow the TEE, the Teal, the Peel model. Obviously you want to be analytical. You want to be talking about the ideas and what they represent and how the novel is used to shape them, but you don't have to have every single thing that you say follow that technique, example, explanation model. As I said before, it may not be appropriate to have a quote in something that you're talking about, and you don't necessarily have to tie everything to a technique too. But you're going to, through your exploration of the text, you're going to show a really deep knowledge and understanding not only of the ideas but of the way that the novel has been constructed to develop that. So second point, talk about the construction. What is it that Goldsworthy is doing? Okay, and finally, a good speech really isn't something that is an essay that's read to the class. A good speech is where you're really thinking about your audience and you're using some rhetorical devices, some um, rhetorical questions, a hypothetical situation, all those things that we have discussed. You're using a more conversational way of developing the points that you want to say. You want to be interesting. You want to present interesting ideas, and you want to leave the audience going, yeah, that was pretty good. That you want them to listen, and you have to make them want to listen. We're all studying the same text, so you want to have an interesting approach so that your ideas are fresh and that they're interesting to listen to. And obviously, finally, we've got that word fluent. We want to have a fluency to it. You want your ideas to run into each other, and you want your speech to have a clear beginning, and you'll build through the middle, and you want to make us really understand that the last thing you're going to say is your final point. That there is a natural conclusion to what you're saying. So good luck with all that, and we'll see you in the next session.